Vivid verses.
The coffee shop near campus had become Nathan Hayes's preferred sanctuary during his final year of graduate study. Not for the overpriced espresso, but for the predictable silence that allowed him to work without interruption. At 29, he'd learned to value efficiency above most things, a lesson reinforced by 5 years of molecular biology research that demanded precision in every measurement, every hypothesis, every conclusion. He was reviewing spectroscopy data on his laptop when she first appeared at his table, a brunette with cautious eyes and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach them. Her name was Vanessa Chun, and she'd opened with a question about the nearest ATM that quickly pivoted to asking about his work. Nathan recognized the approach, deliberate casualness masking intention, but found himself engaged despite his usual wariness. She was articulate, seemingly well-read, and possessed the kind of attentive focus that made conversation feel collaborative rather than performative. Their first proper date occurred 3 days later in an Italian restaurant called Rossetti's on the west side of Portland. Nathan had chosen the location for its distance from campus, a habitual precaution that kept his academic and personal lives separate. Vanessa arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing with the explanation that her babysitter had been delayed. The information arrived without preamble, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to incorporating this detail into first conversations. "I have a son," she clarified over appetizers. "Tyler. He's 3. Nathan noted the shift in her demeanor, a subtle defensive posture, shoulders slightly raised, as if anticipating rejection or judgment. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral while his mind processed the implications. Single parent. Complications. Existing obligations. He filed the observations away without comment, choosing instead to ask how she balanced work and parenting. The question relaxed her visibly, and the remainder of the evening proceeded smoothly. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Vanessa worked irregular hours as a paralegal at a small firm downtown, her schedule dictated by court filings and client emergencies. Nathan's research kept him in the lab until late most evenings, a convenient excuse that also happened to be true. They saw each other twice weekly, always at her initiative, always planned around Tyler's schedule with his grandmother. Nathan met the child exactly once, during an unplanned afternoon when Vanessa's childcare fell through and she'd asked if he could stop by briefly. Tyler was small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and a reserved temperament that manifested as quiet observation rather than the boisterous energy Nathan associated with toddlers. The boy had regarded him with solemn assessment, then returned to his toys without further acknowledgement. Nathan had stayed 20 minutes, made polite conversation, and left with the distinct impression that he'd been evaluated and found irrelevant, a judgment he couldn't entirely fault. The relationship continued for 4 months, pleasant but fundamentally hollow. Vanessa was intelligent company, physically attractive, and relatively undemanding of his time. Yet Nathan found himself analyzing their interactions with the same clinical detachment he applied to failed experiments. There was no genuine intimacy, no progression toward deeper understanding. Their conversations remained surface level, carefully curated exchanges that avoided vulnerability on both sides. He recognized the warning signs by the 3rd month. Vanessa's questions about his future plans had acquired a probing quality. Casual inquiries about where he saw himself in 5 years, whether he'd ever considered staying in Portland long-term, how he felt about family structures. She began mentioning Tyler with increasing frequency, anecdotes clearly designed to present the child as charming and low maintenance. The subtext was transparent. She was auditioning him for a role he had no interest in accepting. The realization crystallized one evening in late October when Vanessa suggested he join her and Tyler for Halloween. Just around the neighborhood, she'd said. Nothing elaborate. I thought it might be nice for Tyler to have you there. She'd caught herself before saying father figure, but the implication hung in the air between them. Nathan had felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, but a cold clarity that made his decision inevitable. He was being positioned as a solution to her circumstances, a convenient partner who could provide stability and co-parenting for a child that wasn't his. The role came with all the obligations of fatherhood and none of the authority, a lifetime sentence to raise another man's son while navigating the mother's inevitable resentment of any actual parental input he might attempt. He declined the Halloween invitation politely, citing lab commitments that were only partially fabricated. Vanessa's expression had flickered through disappointment to something harder before settling on forced understanding. Of course, she'd said, your work comes first. The passive aggression was a tell. Nathan recognized it as the opening move in a pattern he'd observed in friends' relationships. The gradual accumulation of grievances, the weaponization of perceived slights, the transformation of partnership into scorekeeping. He had no interest in that future. He ended it the following week, choosing a Tuesday afternoon when he knew she had to pick up Tyler by 5. They met at a cafe called Northside Grounds, neutral territory that precluded extended scenes. Nathan had prepared his points in advance, approaching the conversation with the same structure methodology he applied to defending research proposals. I don't think this is working, he began, keeping his tone even and his reasoning clear. We're in different life stages, want different things. You have priorities that I'm not equipped to integrate with, and it's not fair to either of us to continue as if compatibility will develop through persistence. Vanessa had stared at him across the small table, her coffee growing cold between her hands. You're breaking up with me because I have a son. I'm ending this because we're fundamentally incompatible, Nathan corrected. Your son is part of your reality, and that's fine. But I'm not interested in being a stepfather. I'm not interested in raising a child that isn't mine, navigating co-parenting dynamics with an absent father, or building a life around someone else's pre-existing family structure. That's not a judgment. It's just a fact about what I want. She'd opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to recalibrate. I never asked you to be his father. Not explicitly, Nathan agreed. But that's the trajectory, and I'm not interested in that destination. The conversation had lasted another 10 minutes. Vanessa cycling through disbelief, hurt, and finally a brittle anger that manifested as cutting observations about his emotional availability and capacity for commitment. Nathan had absorbed each accusation without defending himself, recognizing them as standard responses to rejection rather than genuine insights. When she'd finally left, her departure sharp and unambiguous, he'd felt primarily relief. The weeks that followed were unremarkable. Nathan returned to the comfortable routine of research, teaching obligations, and the occasional social gathering with fellow graduate students. He didn't block Vanessa's number. That seemed unnecessarily dramatic, but he didn't respond to the 2 text messages she sent in the first week, both of which struck him as attempts to reinitiate contact under the guise of forgotten belongings and returned items. By mid-November, he'd largely relegated the entire relationship to the category of minor footnotes, a brief and ultimately inconsequential chapter that had taught him nothing he hadn't already known about his own preferences and boundaries. Then came the encounter that unraveled everything. The bar was called the Copper Still, a deliberately rustic establishment in the Pearl District that catered to young professionals who wanted to feel urbane without committing to actually expensive venues. Nathan had arrived with 2 colleagues from his department, Michelle Park and Tom Brennan, for what had been pitched as a celebratory drink following Tom's successful dissertation defense. He noticed Vanessa almost immediately, seated at the bar with two women he didn't recognize. She was laughing at something one of them had said, her posture relaxed in a way he'd rarely observed during their relationship. Nathan's first instinct was to suggest relocating to a different establishment, but Tom had already ordered a round and was holding forth on his committee's feedback with the manic energy of someone finally released from years of academic pressure. Vanessa spotted him perhaps 20 minutes later. Her expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been pleasure before settling on casual friendliness. She'd approached their table with her wine glass in hand, greeting him with the easy warmth of an old friend rather than a recently discarded romantic partner. "Nathan, I didn't expect to see you here." He'd risen reflexively, manners overriding comfort. "Vanessa, how have you been?" "Good. Really good, actually." She'd smiled, and it had seemed genuine. "Congratulations on, well, whatever you're celebrating." Tom had supplied the explanation, and Vanessa had offered appropriate congratulations before returning to her friends. The interaction had been brief, painless, and left Nathan with a vague sense that perhaps he'd overestimated the emotional intensity she'd invested in their relationship. People moved on. It was fine. An hour later, after Michelle and Tom had departed, Vanessa reappeared. Her friends were leaving, she explained, but she wasn't quite ready to call it a night. Would he mind if she joined him for one more drink? Nathan's internal warning system activated. This was a situation with obvious complication potential, but the alcohol had blunted his usual decisiveness. They were both adults. They could have a civil conversation. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. The conversation that followed was easier than expected. Vanessa seemed lighter, less guarded than she'd been during their relationship. She asked about his research without the undercurrent of resentment that had characterized their later interactions, and shared amusing anecdotes about her work without the pointed references to single-parent struggles. They discovered shared opinions on Portland's increasingly aggressive food car culture and debated the merits of various Thai restaurants in the area with genuine engagement. When she'd suggested continuing the conversation at her apartment, Tyler was with his grandmother for the weekend. She explained Nathan had recognized the invitation for what it was. His more rational self noted this was a categorically poor decision, a regression that would only complicate a cleanly resolved situation. But isolation and ego and the basic mathematics of availability made the alternative, returning alone to his efficiency apartment, less appealing than it should have been. Her apartment was a modest two-bedroom in a building that had been optimistically renovated sometime in the previous decade. Evidence of Tyler existed in the form of toys corralled in baskets and children's books stacked on a shelf, but the space was otherwise adult, decorated with the careful neutrality of someone who'd furnished from Target and IKEA catalogs. They'd barely made it through the door before falling into a familiar physical rhythm, muscle memory overriding judgment. Afterward, lying in her bed in the early hours of Saturday morning, Nathan had felt the expected regret settling over him like a physical weight. This had been monumentally stupid. They'd resolved nothing, only complicated an already messy separation with the kind of ambiguous intimacy that would require another round of clarification and boundary setting. Vanessa had been asleep beside him, her breathing even and untroubled. He'd extracted himself carefully, locating his scattered clothing in the dim light filtering through her bedroom curtains. He was pulling on his shirt when her voice stopped him. "Don't leave yet." He'd turned to find her awake, propped on one elbow, her expression difficult to read in the shadows. "I should go. It's not even 6. Stay for coffee at least. I make excellent coffee." Her tone was light, teasing. "And breakfast. I know you have class later, but you have time." Nathan's mind calculated the variables. Leaving now would be awkward but definitive. Staying for coffee would be polite, potentially less damaging to whatever détente they'd achieved. And she was right. He didn't need to be on campus until 10 for his seminar. The reasoning felt sound enough, though he recognized it as mild justification for avoiding immediate discomfort. Coffee will be fine, he'd agreed. She'd smiled, rising from the bed and pulling on a robe. Make yourself comfortable. This'll just take a few minutes. The apartment's layout placed the kitchen at the far end of a narrow hallway, separated from the bedroom by the bathroom and Tyler's room. Nathan had dressed fully and settled on her couch, his mind already composing the conversation they'd need to have over breakfast. This couldn't happen again. Last night was a mistake born of nostalgia and convenience. They needed to maintain the boundaries he'd established. Civil but separate. He heard the coffee maker gurgling to life, the clink of mugs, the refrigerator opening and closing. Vanessa hummed something he didn't recognize, a tuneless melody that suggested contentment. The domestic sounds were oddly soothing, and Nathan felt his resolve wavering slightly. Maybe they could maintain some kind of friendship. They'd proven they could have pleasant conversation when neither was auditioning for a role in the other's future. She emerged 15 minutes later carrying 2 mugs and a plate of toast, balancing everything with practiced efficiency. Nothing fancy, she said, setting them on the coffee table. But I figured you'd need something before your commute. The coffee was good, dark roast, prepared exactly how he preferred it. He accepted the mug gratefully, taking a long swallow before reaching for a piece of toast. Vanessa settled beside him on the couch, closer than strictly necessary, but not aggressively so. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes before she spoke. I've been thinking about last night. Here it comes, Nathan thought. The negotiation for what this means, where we go from here. He prepared his response, keeping his tone gentle but firm. Vanessa, I just wanted to say I enjoyed it, she continued. No expectations, no pressure. Just, it was nice seeing you again. He'd paused, recalibrating. That was easier than anticipated. It was nice seeing you too. She'd smiled, and something about it struck him as odd. Too pleased, too satisfied, but the coffee was warm in his hands and his mind was already shifting toward the day ahead. His seminar on protein synthesis, the meeting with his advisor about preliminary dissertation data, the mundane architecture of graduate student existence. He finished the coffee and stood to leave, thanking her for breakfast and making appropriately vague comments about taking care. Vanessa walked him to the door, and they'd shared a brief, awkward hug before he stepped into the hallway and headed for the building's exit. The morning was gray and cold, typical November weather in Portland. Nathan walked the 3 blocks to where he'd parked his Honda the previous night, reviewing his mental schedule as he went. His car started without issue, a minor miracle for a vehicle with nearly 200,000 miles, and he pulled into traffic heading east toward campus. He was on the Morrison Bridge when the first cramp hit. It seized his abdomen with sudden, vicious intensity, causing him to gasp and momentarily lose his grip on the steering wheel. The car swerved slightly before he corrected, his mind attempting to catalog the sensation. Food poisoning? Unlikely. The toast had been standard commercial bread, nothing that could cultivate bacteria that quickly. Stomach flu? Possible, though he'd had no symptoms prior to this moment. The second cramp followed 10 seconds later, stronger than the first, accompanied by a wave of nausea that made him regret the coffee. Nathan's hands tightened on the wheel as he focused on maintaining his lane, approaching the end of the bridge with traffic building around him. He needed to pull over. Immediately, a third cramp struck before he could reach the exit, and this time his body convulsed involuntarily, his foot jamming the brake pedal hard enough to activate the anti-lock system. The car behind him blared its horn as it swerved around him. Nathan barely registered the sound. His vision was fracturing, dark spots blooming at the edges like spreading ink. His heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that felt fundamentally wrong. Too fast, too irregular, as if his cardiovascular system was attempting to escape his chest through sheer velocity. Something catastrophically bad was happening. The thought arrived with crystalline clarity even as his body continued its revolt. Not food poisoning, not flu, something acute, something lethal. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely maintain his grip on the wheel. He managed to guide the car to the shoulder, the vehicle lurching to a stop half on the pavement, half on gravel. Nathan fumbled for his phone, his fingers refusing to obey with any precision. The screen swam in his vision as he attempted to unlock it, muscle spasms making the simple gesture nearly impossible. A knock on his window made him turn his head, the movement triggering another wave of nausea and dizziness. A face appeared, middle-aged man, concerned expression, mouth moving with words Nathan couldn't process through the roaring in his ears. The man's hand reached for the door handle. Nathan's body convulsed again, harder this time, his spine arching involuntarily against the seat. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth, a detail he registered with the distant horror of someone observing their own dissolution from outside their body. His last coherent thought before consciousness began to fragment entirely was a simple, terrible deduction. Vanessa. He woke in increments, awareness returning in layers of confusion and discomfort. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic smell, the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Pain in his arm where 4-line had been inserted. A hospital, then. He was in a hospital. Memory assembled itself slowly. The bridge, the cramping, the convulsions. Someone must have called emergency services. He'd been brought here, wherever here was. A nurse appeared at his bedside, noticing his open eyes. "You're awake. Good. How do you feel?" "Terrible," Nathan managed, his voice coming out as a croak. "What happened?" "The doctors will explain everything," she said, adjusting his fore with practiced efficiency. "Just rest for now." But Nathan's mind was already working, sorting through possibilities with the methodical approach that had served him through years of research. Sudden onset, severe symptoms, no prior warning. The timeline was critical. He'd left Vanessa's apartment feeling normal. The symptoms had manifested less than 30 minutes later during his drive. That ruled out most common causes. Food poisoning took hours, not minutes. Viral infections didn't strike with that kind of immediate intensity, which left intentional causes. The thought should have seemed paranoid, the kind of dramatic conclusion drawn by minds predisposed to conspiracy. But Nathan examined it with the same dispassionate logic he'd apply to any hypothesis. He'd consumed nothing between leaving her apartment and the onset of symptoms except what she'd provided. Coffee, toast, simple items, but sufficient vehicles for any number of substances. His mind cataloged her behavior in those final moments. The insistence that he stay for breakfast. The pleased smile that had struck him as odd. The careful statement that she'd enjoyed the evening with no expectations. Not the language of genuine reconciliation. The language of someone completing a transaction. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand, expression grave. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Dr. Patricia Okonkwo. You're very lucky to be alive. What happened to me?" She pulled up a chair, settling in with the deliberate care of someone about to deliver significant information. "You were brought in by paramedics about 2 hours ago. Severe tachycardia, convulsions, hyperthermia. Your heart rate was over 200 beats per minute when you arrived. We administered emergency treatment, ran a full tox screen." She paused, making eye contact. "You were poisoned. Specifically, you ingested a massive dose of methamphetamine." Nathan stared at her, processing. I don't use drugs. We determined that. The quantity in your system wasn't consistent with recreational use. This was a lethal dose, Mr. Hayes. Without immediate intervention, you would have died. As it is, you were minutes away from cardiac arrest when the paramedics found you. His hands clenched the hospital sheets, the only physical outlet for the cold rage beginning to build in his chest. Not anger. He didn't do anger, didn't allow himself the luxury of that particular emotional indulgence. But fury of a different sort, the kind born of violated boundaries and attempted murder. The police will want to speak with you, Dr. Okonkwo continued. And federal agents. This is being treated as attempted homicide. Federal, drug-related crimes cross state lines. The FBI has jurisdiction. She stood, offering what was probably meant as a reassuring smile. For now, you need a rest. Your body has been through severe trauma. The agents will wait until you're stable. They gave him 4 hours. Nathan spent them lying in the hospital bed, his mind working through the architecture of what had happened with the same systematic precision he applied to mapping protein structures. Vanessa had poisoned him. That much was clear. The coffee or the toast. Most likely the coffee, given its stronger flavor to mask any additive. She'd invited him to stay specifically to create the opportunity. Last night hadn't been about nostalgia or closure. It had been set up. The question was why? Revenge for rejection? Possible, but excessive even by the standards of bitter ex-partners. There had to be more to it, some deeper motivation that made attempted murder seem like a rational response. The agents arrived at 2 in the afternoon. A man and woman in unremarkable business attire, credentials identifying them as Special Agents Ramirez and Kim from the FBI's Portland field office. They pulled chairs close to his bed, and Agent Ramirez opened a folder thick with documents. Mr. Hayes, thank you for speaking with us. I know this has been traumatic. I want to tell you everything, Nathan said. Vanessa Chun poisoned me. Agent Kim's pen moved across her notepad. What makes you certain? He walked them through it, laying out the timeline with clinical precision. The breakup, the chance encounter, the night at her apartment, the coffee and toast, the onset of symptoms. He omitted nothing, understanding that any detail might be relevant to building a prosecutable case. When he finished, Agent Ramirez exchanged a look with his partner. Ms. Chun is already in custody. That surprised him. Ow, your phone records. You'd texted your location to a friend before you lost consciousness. Automated check-in, apparently. We traced your movements, interviewed witnesses at the bar, determined you'd left with Ms. Chun. When we showed up at her apartment this morning with a warrant, we found methamphetamine in her possession. Enough to indicate intent to distribute, not personal use. She talked, Agent Kim added. Once she realized we had physical evidence, she provided a statement. Mr. Hayes, she confessed to poisoning you. Nathan absorbed this, his mind racing ahead to implications and consequences. What? Agent Ramirez leaned forward, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and what might have been sympathy. According to her statement, she believed that if she couldn't have you, nobody should. She'd planned this since the breakup. The encounter at the bar wasn't coincidental. She'd been monitoring your social media, knew you'd be there. Everything that followed was orchestrated to create the opportunity. The words should have triggered some emotional response. Fear, betrayal, horror at how close he'd come to death. But Nathan felt primarily a cold, analytical satisfaction at having his deduction confirmed. He'd been right. The evidence had supported the hypothesis. The conclusion had been sound. There's more, Agent Kim said. Ms. Chen's cooperation extends beyond the confession. She's providing information about the source of the methamphetamine. Family members running a distribution operation. Her testimony is going to bring down a significant network. In exchange for what? A reduced sentence, Agent Ramirez said. Federal prosecutors are still negotiating, but she's looking at somewhere between 8 and 12 years instead of life without parole. She'll serve time, Mr. Hayes. Significant time, but it won't be the full penalty for attempted murder. 8 to 12 years. Nathan calculated. Vanessa was 28 now. She'd be nearly 40 when released. Tyler would be a teenager, raised by grandparents or lost to the foster system. The child who'd observed him with such solemn indifference would grow up without his mother, collateral damage in her obsessive rage. He felt no satisfaction in that outcome, but no guilt either. Tyler's situation was tragic, but it was the consequence of his mother's choices, not Nathan's refusal to accept a role he'd never wanted. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your testimony, eventually. Medical records, which will subpoena. Any communications between you and Ms. Chun that might establish pattern of behavior." Agent Ramirez closed his folder. "For now, focus on recovery. We'll be in touch as the case develops." They left him with business cards and assurances of protection, though Nathan suspected Vanessa posed no further threat. She'd made her attempt, failed, and now faced the grinding machinery of federal prosecution. Her focus would be on minimizing her own consequences, not on him. The hospital discharged him 3 days later with a prescription for follow-up cardiology appointments and stern warnings about monitoring for long-term effects of the poisoning. Nathan returned to his apartment, to the familiar surroundings that now felt slightly foreign, as if he'd been gone months rather than days. His advisor called that evening, having heard through the graduate student network's efficient gossip apparatus. She offered extensions on deadlines, connections to counseling services, the full apparatus of institutional support. Nathan accepted the extensions. He wasn't superhuman. The physical recovery alone would require time, but declined the counseling. He'd process this the way he processed everything, through analysis, categorization, and integration into his understanding of the world. The story appeared in the local news 2 weeks later, a brief article about a paralegal arrested for attempted murder and involvement in a methamphetamine distribution ring. Vanessa's name was mentioned, along with the bare facts of the case. Nathan read it once, then deleted the bookmark and returned to his work. His colleagues treated him with the careful courtesy reserved for survivors of violent crimes, a mixture of sympathy and discomfort that made normal conversation difficult. He tolerated it for a week before delivering a brief statement at a department meeting. He was fine. He appreciated their concern. He preferred not to discuss it further. The message was received, and the awkwardness gradually dissipated into routine. Federal prosecutors contacted him in January to coordinate testimony for Vanessa's eventual trial, though they indicated the case would likely resolve through plea agreement before reaching that stage. Nathan prepared nevertheless, reviewing his statement with the same thoroughness he applied to defending his research. The facts were straightforward. His testimony would be devastating because it was simply the truth, delivered without embellishment or emotional appeal. The plea agreement came through in March. Vanessa Chun pleaded guilty to attempted murder and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. In exchange for her cooperation against her family members, she received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 8. Her son Tyler would be raised by her parents, the same people who'd enabled her to orchestrate an evening that had nearly ended in Nathan's death. Nathan attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery and watching Vanessa stand before the judge in prison orange, her expression blank and defeated. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. The judge had pronounced sentence with appropriate gravity, noting the seriousness of the crimes and the mitigating factor of her cooperation. 10 years. Tyler will be 13, when she was potentially released. Walking out of the courthouse into the gray Portland afternoon, Nathan had felt primarily relief that this chapter was definitively closed. Vanessa would serve her time. He would complete his dissertation. Life would continue with the indifferent momentum that characterized existence regardless of individual trauma. His dissertation defense occurred in late May, a grueling 3-hour examination of his research on protein folding mechanisms. His committee approved the work unanimously, and Nathan accepted congratulations with the same measured composure that had carried him through the previous months. Dr. Hayes now. The title felt simultaneously significant and meaningless. He accepted a postdoctoral position at a research institute in Seattle, relocating in July to a city where nobody knew about Vanessa Chun or attempted murder or the morning he nearly died on a bridge. The work consumed his attention in the way he preferred, providing structure and purpose and the satisfaction of incremental progress toward understanding fundamental biological processes. Occasionally, during quiet moments in the lab or lying awake in his new apartment, Nathan would find himself thinking about the encounter at the Copper Still, about the decision to accept one more drink and where it had led. A different choice would have resulted in a different outcome. He could have declined, could have left when his colleagues did, could have recognized the invitation to her apartment for the trap it was. But regret seemed pointless. He'd made decisions based on available information and survived the consequences through a combination of strangers' intervention and emergency medical care. The experience had confirmed what he'd already known. His instincts about incompatibility had been sound. Vanessa's obsession had proven his caution justified. What he felt, examining his response in the months that followed, was primarily validation. He'd read the situation correctly, ended it decisively, and survived an attempt to punish him for exercising rational judgment. The system had functioned. Justice, imperfect but functional, had been served. Tyler would grow up without his mother, and that was genuinely tragic. But Nathan had never sought that role, had explicitly rejected it, and bore no responsibility for the woman's decision to respond with poison rather than acceptance. Some people couldn't tolerate rejection. Some relationships ended cleanly, and others detonated with violence. The trick, Nathan had concluded, was maintaining the clarity to distinguish between the two before accepting coffee from someone who'd already proven they couldn't accept boundaries. In Seattle, he rebuilt routine. Research, publications, the occasional social gathering with colleagues who knew nothing of his history beyond his academic credentials. He dated occasionally, brief encounters that ended when expectations exceeded what he was willing to provide. The pattern was familiar, comfortable, sustainable. A year after the sentencing, he received a letter forwarded from his old Portland address. It was from Vanessa, written from the federal facility where she was serving her sentence. Nathan held the envelope for several minutes, debating whether to open it. Curiosity finally won. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in careful script. She apologized, explained, though not excused, her actions as the product of desperation and mental illness she hadn't recognized until forced treatment in prison. She hoped he was doing well. She didn't ask for forgiveness or even response. It read like the kind of exercise assigned by a therapist, a step in some recovery process that required acknowledging harm caused. Nathan read it twice, then placed it in his filing cabinet under miscellaneous correspondence. He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Her apology changed nothing about what had happened or the consequences that had followed. It existed as a data point, mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant to his current life. Tyler would be 5 now, Nathan calculated. Attending kindergarten, building memories that wouldn't include his mother. Growing up with the kind of formative absence that would shape his psychology in ways impossible to predict. none of which was Nathan's responsibility or concern. But he thought about the child occasionally, the solemn boy who'd regarded him with such indifference that single afternoon. Life was full of collateral damage. People made choices, and others bore the consequences. The architecture of cause and effect didn't pause for fairness or sentiment. Tyler had been dealt a difficult hand through no fault of his own, but the world was full of children navigating absent parents and fractured families. He'd survive, or he wouldn't, thrive, or struggle, ultimately become whoever the combination of genetics and environment determined. Nathan had survived his own close call with death and moved forward. That was the only outcome over which he'd had any real control. The research continued. Papers were published. Conferences were attended. Years accumulated with the quiet persistence of time, refusing to acknowledge individual drama. And if Nathan found himself occasionally checking coffee for odd tastes or declining breakfast invitations from recent acquaintances, well, that seemed like reasonable precaution rather than paranoia. Some lessons, he reflected, were worth learning only once.
Thanks for listening.